Joe Ward is potentially on the way out of Derby County with a deal to Mansfield Town looking all said and done. Now, the big talk about Joe Ward and potentially this move to Mansfield Town is that it's been about a week now since we originally spoke about the link, and it has not been completed as of time of recording, and that's obviously really disappointing for Derby County and for Joe Ward. Joe Ward came into Derby County with tons of promise and a brilliant opportunity to really step forward in what he can do this in his position. And he was one of the better players in League One in his role. But ultimately, the move from Peterborough to Derby County to go from Darren Ferguson to Paul Warne just hasn't really worked. And there's a lot of ways you can view it, a lot of ways you can look at it, but for me, I think it all comes down to the big injury he had back in the start of that season. I think it happened against Oxford United, where he ripped the fat pad off his heel. Now, he did go on to make about 33 appearances for Derby County in League One last season, but ultimately this season, he's played second, third, fourth fiddle at the right back slot, with even Curtis Nelson and Nat Phillips preferred out in that role over Joe Ward. Now, for me, I think the biggest problem has been that Paul Warne hasn't been willing to experiment with him and play him further forward in a right wing position or a left wing position or even a number 10 position, which I think personally is a big mistake on behalf of Paul Warne, because I think Joe Ward can have a massive impact on Derby County if he was to play games. Now, ultimately, you can't really drop players just to give Joe Ward an opportunity, but there has been opportunities where he could have played on the right-hand side, or he could have played in the number 10 or on the left-hand side, and he hasn't really been given those, and that's what's been the most unfortunate thing. Now, Joe Ward started last season, in my opinion, in really good form. Before that injury, which kept him out for 3 or 4 months, I thought he was one of our better players. Then, obviously, with that injury, Jake Rooney stepped up because Kane Wilson wasn't fit either. Jake Rooney put in some really good performances, and then Jake Rooney goes down with an injury, which ends up with Derby County picking up the signing of Ryan Nyambe, which has been a magnificent signing for Derby County and one which has really, really pushed them forward heading into the back end of that campaign. Well, from, I think he signed in September all the way towards the end of the season, and he's been brilliant for Derby County in the Championship as well. And it's just one of those things where, because of the injuries, we ended up having to sign a right back, and that ended up being one of the best right backs I think I've seen at Derby County in a defensive standpoint. I think he's absolutely unbelievable, Ryan Nyambe, and that's been the problem. And then if we're going to go more attacking, you've got Kane Wilson, who, in my opinion, is better defensively than Ward, and going forward has just as much impact. So you're not really losing out on anything by having Kane Wilson over Joe Ward. Now, I always thought that the whole intention of having Ward and Wilson was that Ward would play on the right, further forward, Wilson would play behind, and sort of like Ward and Mendez-Lang would be rotating. But ultimately, that never ended up being the case, and Joe Ward never really got those opportunities further forward. But when he did, up against Portsmouth in that league tie, which was massively important for Derby County's season, they had to get something out of the game in order to keep the battle for the title alive, really. Although it wasn't really alive, it was there. And Joe Ward put in an excellent performance that day, scored 2 really, really nice goals, one with an excellent run from Corey Blackett-Taylor. And for me, I think we saw that day just what Joe Ward can do. And I think what we've seen this season from Joe Ward, he came in out of the cold against Burnley, in my opinion, put in a brilliant performance, and then hasn't played since. Or he's come on for like 5 minutes or whatever. And for me, it's just disappointing to see that a player of the quality of Joe Ward isn't getting game time. He can score goals at this level. He can get assists at this level. We saw it when he was at Peterborough. And then we saw in League One just how effective he can be for Peterborough. And he played in that forward position there. And for me, my problem stems back to Paul Warne and his lack of experimentation to play a player like Joe Ward in that forward position. Because why on earth would you sign a player like Joe Ward, who you know defensively is a little bit of a liability, and then try and play him at right back in a back four? You wouldn't, in my opinion. And I understand that Paul Warne and his coaching staff have certain aspects of things, and there's Mendez-Lang last season was in incredible form, but ultimately this season isn't so much. So why not give Ward that opportunity? Now, you'll have seen the Leyton Orient game last night, but as I'm recording this, it hasn't been played. And it's going to be interesting to see if Joe Ward gets on the pitch in that game, I'll talk about it in the review video, which will have been posted last night. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure you go ahead and do so, because I do believe that Joe Ward deserves an opportunity at Championship level. Now, obviously, we've spoke about the potential clubs that could be in for him, with obviously Mansfield Town being the one that seems to have the most notoriety at the moment. But it seems as if League One clubs will monitor this situation, and if Peterborough have a bright spark, they'll come in and potentially bring him back to the Western Home Stadium, where I think he'd absolutely thrive, being back at Peterborough, back playing football again. I think he'd really hit his stride again, and I'm just really, really disappointed with how this deal's been handled. And it goes back to the same thing with Corey Blackett-Taylor of, realistically, Joe Ward essentially lost the confidence of Paul Warne. I think he gave 2 penalties away in 2 games. One was in like the 93rd minute, one was in like the 47th minute just before half time, and that was when it sort of felt as if Joe Ward was never going to play for Derby County again. And ultimately since then, I bet he's only made maybe 10, 11 appearances, if that, because he's only made 6 this season in total, which is disappointing. And I do believe Joe Ward has quality. I think he could have a massive, massive go in that right wing position. And when you look at Mendes Lang at the moment, I don't quite think he's performing to the levels that we anticipate as Derby County fans. And that's where I believe that Joe Ward could obviously take that position. But then you look at the signings we're looking at with Harvey Nibbs, Louis Barry, 2 players who can play in those wide positions and maybe take over from a Mendes Lang or a Caden Jackson, and you sort of go, oh well, Joe Ward's further down the pecking order in that position as well, further down Kane Wilson as well, and it just shuts down them options. And that's where we go back to Blackett-Taylor again, who I spoke about this morning, where you look at those potential players coming in of Harvey Nibbs and Louis Barry, and he just drops right down the pecking order in the wing position as well. You already look at it, and you've probably got Barkhazen ahead of him at the moment anyway, which, in my opinion, absolutely shouldn't be the case. But that's what it seems to be at the moment. And I'm not quite sure how Paul Warne picks his teams. I'm not sure how Paul Warne looks through the players that he's got. Obviously, I don't have access to the running data, the training data and all that stuff that they have access to at Derby County. But Joe Ward and Corey Blackett-Taylor must be showing something terrible to not be able to get a game for Derby County. Now, I completely understand the situation we're in, where we are in and around that relegation scrap, but when you're not rotating your squad, your players get tired. You then have games like we had at Bristol City, where in the second half just didn't really offer a great deal. And it's one of those for me where sometimes you just have to shake up the pack. Chuck in a Joe Ward on the right, chuck in a Blackett-Taylor on the left, chuck in a Jake Rooney at right back. Just make some changes to see what they can do, because ultimately we're in the shit anyway. So why not give them an opportunity to show that they're capable of staying in this division and playing for this club, because they're not really getting bench opportunities where they're coming off the bench. So it sort of dispels the idea that they're depth options, in my opinion. And I personally believe Paul Warne sees our squad as like a 14-man squad. I think most of the bench is irrelevant to him, really. And he'll bring them on if we're losing or if we're clearly winning a game, but he doesn't really give them much opportunity to actually make an impact. And we'll just have to see what happens. Obviously, there's a long way to go in this window as I'm recording this. It's the 12th of January. You'll be seeing this on Wednesday, which I believe is the 15th. So let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Hit that subscribe button, turn on that notification bell, hit the like button as well, and I'll catch you in my next video.